Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne Shanahan at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and I am delighted to welcome you to Reimagining the World Together, How Friendship Matters for Our Future. This series will bring together a set of friends and colleagues, often unlikely duos, to share how their relationship has shaped their lives, their work, and their commitments. 2,300 years ago, Aristotle wrote about the absolute necessity of friendship. We hope that out of these conversations between friends, we will learn something about why friendship is an absolute necessity in life, not only for our psychic well-being, but also as the creative force that can empower us to reimagine the world and to change it. True friendship is transformative. It bears noting that we often think about friendship as something that just happens. It's easy, it's organic, it's comfortable, it's fun. I think for me, it wasn't until my mid-20s in a train station in Madras, in the middle of a flash flood in which I'd lost both my shoes and my passport, and during one of my most heated arguments, that I found perhaps more aptly, I recognized my first true friendship. I remember the precise moment when I thought to myself, I absolutely hate this woman. And right after I thought, and she is the very best friend I've ever had. I'd been traveling for weeks with this friend, a colleague, evaluating a set of small women's microfinance initiatives through small villages in South Asia. It was a grand adventure, it was fascinating work, and I had significant, if personal and inchoate commitments. But we were a horrible partnership, having next to nothing in common, and quite opposite temperaments and work styles. She was no fun, and she made work even less fun. So every day was exhausting, but not because of the work, but because of our relationship. And in some ways, I resented her that. It wasn't until that very moment where I stood shoeless and wanting just for a minute to wallow in a bit of my trivial loss, and she was peppering me to complete our latest report, that I realized that together we were able to do something that neither of us could ever do alone. We were able to work in communities that neither of us ever would have dared enter, collaborate with, or help inspire. The way we drove each other to do better, the way we got excited about making the work the best that it could be, is also what enabled others to attempt their best. So in that moment, soaking wet, we ugly cried like babies and then shared a chocolate bar. 30 years on, it is this very same friend I go to for a bit of reason, for when I need a partner in crime for a scheme, for inspiration, or for much needed course correction. Every time it's hard. And it's that reason that I truly love her. Understanding the hard work, the unexpected magic, and the wondrous power of friendship is the goal of this series. This series is part of the Purpose Project at Duke that makes character, questions of purpose, and explorations of one's life work signature features of the Duke experience. It is a collaboration between Duke Divinity, the Office of Undergraduate Education, and the Kenan Institute for Ethics. It is funded by the Duke Endowment, and the 5-year project seeks to facilitate diverse conversations, foster unlikely partnerships, and field curricular and co-curricular experiments that enable students, undergraduates, graduate, and professional, to pursue questions of moral purpose and a life well lived as an integral part of their Duke experience. And so with that, as is always awkward when leaving a Zoom, I'm going to leave this conversation to the fabulous Adriane Lentz-Smith, Professor of History here at Duke, to take it from here and introduce today's esteemed guests and friends, colleagues, William Barber and Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove. So Adriane, enjoy. See ya.
Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, I'm Adriane Lentz-Smith, and I have the great pleasure and honor of moderating this conversation and introducing this evening's conversationalists. I will start with the one who's actually here with us. Reverend Barber will be joining us as soon as he can get to us. But Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove is here with us now. He is a celebrated spiritual writer and sought after speaker, a native of North Carolina. He is a graduate of Eastern University and Duke Divinity School. Jonathan and his wife, Lee, founded Hospitality, where the formerly homeless share community with the formerly housed. Jonathan directs the School for Conversion, a popular education center that works to make surprising friendships possible. He is also an associate minister at the historically Black St. John's Missionary Baptist Church. Joining us soon will also be the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber. He is the president and senior lecturer of repairers of the breach, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, bishop with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He's also the architect of the Forward Together moral movement that gained national acclaim with its Moral Monday protests at the North Carolina General Assembly in 2013. You might be able to hear my hound dog in the background, who has decided that his friendship is part of this conversation, whether we want it to be or not. So Woody makes everything better. So the thing I didn't mention in my intro, Jonathan, is that you and Reverend Barber wrote the third Reconstruction together, right? Which in some ways is a, it is a visionary program, but you might also think about it as, the work that comes out of friendship and collaboration. But if that's like this point in your relationship, in your comradeship, I wonder if you could take us back a little bit and tell us your story. Because, you always ask people and different, you'd ask two parties and they have different stories of how their friendship started. But sort of how did the two of you become friends?
Get my version in before he gets in.
Right, exactly.
Well, I am delighted to be with you and to have this conversation. My roots are here in North Carolina, and I grew up in tobacco country in the 80s and early 90s when, as I've come to learn, the moral majority was very focused on recruiting religious communities like the one that I was growing up in to be part of the Republican Party. They didn't exactly pitch it that way, but that's what it was about. Be pro-family, be pro-life, and become part of a really a coalition of white people who would vote together. And that was sold to us in terms of our faith and our religion. So as a young person, I wanted to do all that I could for Jesus. I had, walked the aisle at the Baptist church when I was 7 years old, and very sincerely wanted to do all that I could. And I thought that meant becoming president of the United States. So I was trying to get in line to become, a politician. And I thought I needed to go to the Naval Academy to do that. And I learned to get to the Naval Academy, I needed a recommendation from a senator. So I went to Page in the US Senate for Strom Thurmond. And I got to his office when I was 16 years old. And it was my first time, inside the Beltway, inside the offices and the conversations that happen in Washington, D.C. And it suddenly occurred to me that the movement that people like me were, training to be part of, and that my people had really empowered, was not, by and large, about pursuing what the Sunday school teachers had taught us, in public life. It was not about trying to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It was mostly about making sure that defense contractors got their money, that big corporations got their tax cuts, and I was immediately disillusioned by that, and came back to North Carolina, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do, because I still I held on to my faith. I held on to this conviction that, my people who raised me had loved me well and taught me, whatever you really believe, you got to be about it and give yourself to it in the world. But I didn't know another way to be Christian in public life. And then I met Reverend Barber. He was working as the director of the Human Relations Commission in North Carolina at that time. And I was part of this group that the governor's office organized here, of young people trying to get involved in politics. And I went to this weekend conference, and I think he was supposed to just give us a motivational speech, but anyone who's ever heard him talk knows that he's a preacher who preaches wherever he goes. And by the time he was done preaching that evening to us young political hopefuls, I recognized somebody who spoke the same language, the cadence of the King James Version, you know, that we were both raised on. He spoke that language, but applied it in a very different way. And so I reached out and said, I'd love for him to come preach at my church, because if you hear a good preacher, that's what you say. Would you come preach at my church? And he said, he looked at me, you know, a white boy from rural North Carolina, and said, you get your pastor to invite me and I'll come. And well, as it happened, you know, the pastor's son and I were good friends, and he agreed. So that was the beginning of our relationship about 25 years ago now. Had
you had Black pastors at your church?
Oh, Lord, no.
Is it coming up? Right?
Lord, no. It never occurred to me that we hadn't. You know, I grew up in a context that had very much accepted the sort of post-racial narrative. We thought the civil rights movement had fixed everything in terms of, you know, racism in this country. And it didn't occur to us that we still worship with all white people. That was just, you know, the norm. So no, I didn't even think about it as a sort of radical thing. You know, there's a list in every institution of the firsts, you know, the first Black person to do something, the first woman to do something, you know, whatever the firsts are. And I'm sure he was the first African-American preacher to preach in that pulpit, but that didn't even occur to me. I was just delighted to meet someone who could connect faith to a kind of conversation about what it means to pursue justice and equality and the common good, in a way that made sense to me. And it's taken me quite some time to learn that there is a very organized resistance to that. and that what didn't occur to me as a boy, well, there were people who didn't want that to happen.
So it sounds like you were already, well, hello. That's, I was about to ask a follow-up question. Hi, Reverend Barber, it's perfect timing. I just got Jonathan's version of the story of how y'all became friends. So as we welcome you to join the conversation.
Yeah, the real story.
Yeah. There's always, what is it? There's the initial story, and then there's the, what do you call it? The official, or the accepted story, the authoritative story. So y'all can wrestle over who has which one. But first, welcome, and thank you for rushing to get here.
Thank you. Glad to be on today.
And thank you for being where you've been today. But so we were opening just with a big open-ended question, which is, how did y'all become friends?
Life, being in the movement, being put in a place where we did not plan to be in. What does it say? You have been signed out. I don't understand what it means. Yeah, being in a place where we didn't expect it. Just two people whose lives crossed, both, I guess, in search for what we were to be doing with our lives. And it happened to be that one night we were together and didn't know we were together in a speech that I did for the Youth Legislative Congress in North Carolina. And as Jonathan likes to say, it was supposed to be a lecture, and I decided to preach and decided to talk about the gospel in terms of justice and love. And he says he heard something that he didn't realize it was missing, but he knew when he heard it, it was missing. And then I had to take a risk when they came up and asked me that night, him and his friend, if I would come do their baccalaureate. And he told me where they were from. I said yes, but I thought it was kind of, they weren't going to get them, the people to agree to that. And so it was one of those kind of yes that you can give, but you're not expecting to have to follow through on it. Because I was just sure that the people were not going to have me come, not to that particular part of North Carolina, and what I knew about it. And so, and sure enough, they did, and I did, and it was interesting, to say the least. I knew that area. I knew the history of the Klan, knew the history of that community. But we went and, you know, over the years, we got separated, I think, Jonathan. But something of what we said that during that time, and his thinking and his change in direction and his going to seminary and, I mean, the undergraduate school in a very different place. And then I later on find out some of his work in Iraq. Was it Iraq? Yeah, Iraq. And then he was back doing some real prophetic work, kind of new monasticism work. And I happened to read this book, and in the book I opened it, and there I am mentioned. And it's one of those kind of things that you call seed sowing. That's the best way I've been able to describe it. It was a seed sown. I never forgot him. He never forgot me. And then the movement in Moral Monday brought us back together. And we kind of picked up from where we were, but we started to go deeper and talk about what did this friendship, what was it supposed to mean beyond just us, right? What was supposed to mean for the larger theological, moral conversations in this country. And it's a counterintuitive, if you would write the story, I was never supposed to meet him, he was never supposed to meet me, and if we did, we would surely be on opposite sides. And the exact opposite has happened. But you know, the Holy Ghost works like that. The Holy Ghost puts people together for different moments in time. And so we've been trying to think together, write together, go to jail together, pray together, sometimes curse together, get frustrated together, be family together, preach in pulpits together, have difficult conversations together. I just left Charlotte, Jonathan, and I was reminded, you know, we were trying to do a press conference about truth and justice, and some people came out there and basically told us we were all going to hell because we were all gay, they used the F word, we were the Antichrist, we were just talking about love, talking about healthcare, talking about the things Jesus talked about. They were carrying crosses. And
I was going to ask you if they thought of themselves as religious.
Well, yeah, you know, I wouldn't say it's Christian, but certainly as religious. They had beards, they had camouflage on, they had crosses, they had big signs saying repent, go to hell, different things. And I thought about how deluded people are. But, you know, I expected it, I think, because we went to Charlotte today to cast down a demon. And demons don't like to be dealt with easily. And by demons, I don't mean something with the head turned around like on Friday the 13th. Yeah. But for me, when I say demons, it's kind of like Walter Winks, the scholar at Union, that talked about demons as representing the systems of injustice, the systems of wickedness in high places. And so I kind of expected it when I was praying this morning, that something was going to happen. Because whenever you dare to tell the truth, lies will resist it, you know. And so it happened. Right there in Charlotte, yeah. But I thought about how glad I am to know Jonathan, because if I had not, you know, I had some deep distrust about my brother, Sister Smith, about my white brothers and sisters, because of things that happened to me early in my life, having to deal with the Klan, burning crosses in front of my uncle's house, who had married interracially. You know, some of the things my father had been through. You know, you develop a certain distrust. And I think in some ways, Jonathan and a few other people, but him in particular, from helping to save me from my memories. Because, you know, sometimes memories can keep you from movement. Memories can keep you from moving together with people who you don't expect to be working with. Memories can sometimes block you. And we saw that often with Jesus and his disciples. Jesus would do something new, and they said, but we didn't do it like that before. Or those people are not supposed to be with us. And Jesus would say, wait a minute, I have others who are not of this fold. Wait a minute, before you start saying who can't be in, be careful now. And so I'm glad in some ways that he helped me not live in not live bound by the memories. I don't want to forget the lessons. There are some mean people out here. You know, I had to remember that today. Those were not the folk that just go over and try to pray with them. They probably were packing. They probably had guns. They probably deluded. But I never wanted to live in the memory that kind of memory mandates my life to a point that I'm limited in who I can engage with and who I can believe has the same heart for justice that I do.
Well, so that brings me to a question. It brings me to ask you the same question that I was about to ask Jonathan. So maybe I'll ask both of y'all, and then you can both give your separate answers. But I was going to ask you, Jonathan, like, obviously you were on one path and you started and you turned and took a different, you turned away from imagining that sort of the road to Jesus was through the moral majority or through being president. But I suspect that that also took you away from certain members of your community or certain comforts or things that you'd known. And so my question for you is, were you afraid, right? Were you afraid to make that shift and to make those moves? And then similarly, and because when you were saying that you realized you were going, I think, Jonathan, you were from a sundown town, right? So this sort of, you know, sort of when you realized where you were being invited to and you realized that they meant their invitation, Reverend Barber, did you have a moment of just fear? Because I would have thought, oh Lord, maybe I have to wash my hair that Sunday morning.
Yeah. Well, one of the great gifts of our friendship that I was thinking about as, you know, Reverend Barber was telling his side of the story is that he helped me to learn the history behind why, you know, a young person like me didn't even realize that I was lacking friendship with someone like him, right? That there has been a kind of systemic effort to divide people and to normalize that. And so I think the fear that I had inside of me and, you know, hadn't really named, but certainly had to grapple with it once, you know, circumstances began to challenge these assumptions. The fear was of the unknown, right? What happens? What happens when people come together and realizing that, you know, the system is set up to keep us apart from one another? What happens when we begin to organize and to challenge that system? I remember the first time I walked into a state house behind Reverend Barber. Now, you know, I have lived as a straight white man in the world. When I walk into places, I'm generally welcomed. And when I'm not, I'm generally respectful of what people, you know, of authority, because that's how I was raised. And here we were going to challenge the system and they told us we can't come in. Well, my body, you know, something in my body, if I'm told I can't come in, just says, well, yes, sir, I understand. Reverend Barber says, tell me where that's written down. You know, show me that rule. And I all of a sudden realized that, you know, there are ways that my body carries a memory of a certain relationship to this society that I have to unlearn if I'm going to be part of this kind of fusion coalition that, I mean, our friendship represents, but it's not just about two people being buddies. This is about a vision for what society can be. And that necessarily means challenging the systems as they exist. So I think it's that fear of the unknown that we have to confront, and not knowing what all it's going to take to change what is into what ought to be.
Yeah, I don't know how I would describe it as fear. You know, I had seen a lot of this with my father, this intersectional cross-racial work. I think I was clear that Jonathan just said, it's not just about being buddy-buddy. You don't change racism by just being buddy-buddy. There was a sense in which in the South, many times slave masters and slaves got along as long as everybody stayed in their place. And so, you know, but also, you know, the challenge that I had to learn even more was that many of the people where Jonathan lived, many of the people I've come to know now in places like Appalachia, facing the same problems of poverty and healthcare. I found out that Appalachian populism is not a whole lot different than civil rights activism. And that's why the system had to kill Dr. King. They couldn't afford for those people to start coming together. He said that. I mean, in 1965, he said every time, not sometime, but every time, there is the possibility of poor blacks and poor whites coming together, create a new political reality and build a beloved community. The aristocracy sows division. The aristocracy can't steal your tax dollars. It can't make the money if poor black people and white people, and then you add Latinos and natives, come together around a common agenda. And so in some ways, I became more fearful. What if we aren't friends? What if we don't do this work? What if we don't move beyond just, as you say, buddy, and really into building a new society? What if we miss this opportunity? You know, sometimes my fears are more not about what we face, but what if we don't face them? What's the problem? I told someone one day, I'm clear that the Lord is not going to hold me accountable at the end of my days. For instance, if I didn't pray, if everybody I prayed for to get well didn't get well, but he might hold me accountable if I didn't even try. Yeah. The Lord is not going to hold me accountable if everything we fight for justice doesn't get changed, but he might hold me accountable if we don't try. You know, the Lord is not going to hold us accountable for if every truth we tell does not get accepted, but the Lord might hold us accountable if we don't tell the truth. If we don't do the work of truth telling. And so if Jonathan and I don't model this, both in terms of friendship, but in terms of focus and in terms of faith, and in terms of fighting the political systems that live through people like him and I being divided and separated, you know, there's a certain responsibility we will bear if things don't get better, you know, especially when you know better. And so I think we've taken it very seriously that this is a matter of life and bringing people together. And so every time we're able to go somewhere and show people what's possible, not only in terms of a personal friendship, but a political friendship and political transformation and personal transformation. I'm more afraid of not doing that than I am doing it. You know, I know the day you talk about your feelings, Jonathan, about shaking at the building going in. You know, today something moved on me, and after the press conference, I started going to where the guys were. I just went, I want to know what has got you so messed up. Of course, security wouldn't let me go because they knew that they probably had some other things. But I started going. They were like, "No, Reverend Barber, come back." I was like, but I'm so. And in some ways, I just felt so sorry for them. What is wrong with you? No. Because I can look at them and tell they are not all that wealthy. Probably half of the things I'm fighting for, you need, your children need, your communities need. Damn this demon of racism that has gotten you so messed up that you actually see me as an enemy. And you're telling me to shut up, but the very things I'm over here promoting are the things you're going to end up benefiting from. Yeah. And so in a real sense, I think sometimes for me, the fear, it's not so much what you'll face, but what becomes of your life if you don't face it. You know, I was accused one day, I don't know if I told you this, Jonathan, it was in a conversation and somebody said, you know the problem people have with you, right? And they said, you just want to organize white people. And I said, what? And they said, well, you just want to organize white people. I said, oh, so y'all playing the reverse game. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, it used to be the game was if you had 1/8 black blood, you were black. So what y'all are saying to me, just because I have a few deep white friends and I can go to, and I'm willing to go to Appalachia just as well as I'm willing to go to Alabama, but I'm willing to go to Maine just as willing to go to Mississippi. You didn't think that somehow that's an abandonment of your way of thinking. And this was a black person talking to me, and I said, and that's very sad. But it shows how ugly this whole racial construct has messed us up so bad that we actually become afraid of fellow humanity. And we can't even see sometimes beyond it. And we get afraid of even moving beyond, the trust factors. And Jonathan and I think have to model for people. We don't always agree. But we've learned how to do it in a way. Sometimes we'll be writing and he'll say, well, I don't think about that. Or he might write something. I say, no, I'm not. No. But what we do agree on is that there are some things tearing at the very heart and soul of this experiment in democracy. And it really is under threat when it comes to the battles of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism. What we are clear on is something my grandmother, I often say this to them, my grandmama taught me, you scratch a lie, you find a thief. And we go into communities, sometimes in the mountains, and we tell folk, y'all need to understand, if you scratch a racist, you'll find a thief. So the people up here that may be sowing racism and sowing fear to you, guess what? Those same persons will steal your health care. They'll steal your living wages. They'll steal your water, their clean water. Don't trust them. I told a group of steel workers that one time, John, you remember that speech where I went to 10,000 steel workers, mostly white. And I said, I know y'all, some of y'all voted for Trump. And it was about a year after they voted, and they were mad because he had, done some things against them. And I said, let me say to this, you in love. I understand why you did it. I really do. I understand, because he used all of the buttons. He used the code words and all that kind of stuff. And some of you all heard that, but what you didn't hear and what you didn't learn from history is that all of that racism meant one thing: you couldn't trust him with your labor rights either. And I know nobody ever taught you that, but it's time to learn it. Mm-hmm. By the end of that conference, people were crying and clapping their hands and saying, you're right. I might not have been able to be that comfortable saying that if I hadn't met Jonathan Hartgrove.
So my grandfather's way of saying,
if I hadn't met you, here's one thing that I know wouldn't have happened. On the 400th anniversary last year of, the first enslaved Africans arriving in Virginia, 3 generations of my family went to Fort Monroe, and we kind of walked through the whole story with folks up there, and we ended up under the Freedom Tree. And now we're talking about, people who were just talking, collectively. Our family was on the wrong side of the civil rights movement. We were, on the wrong side of the whole formation of the moral majority, and in terms of, really standing and voting against the interests of Black and brown neighbors. But here we were under the Freedom Tree, where they, during Reconstruction, or even before the end of the war, they began to teach young people and began to imagine public education as an essential right in a democracy. And 3 generations of my white family sitting under that tree, we looked at each other and said, we have education because of the people who fought for it from right here. Like if you go back that far in our family, we were poor white farmers who didn't have any access to public education.
Uh-huh.
And the only reason I have an education, my parents got an education, is because some Black folks and white folks came together during Reconstruction and fought for that as a right. The plantation owners sure weren't going to give it to us. It took Black political power. And I think that kind of realization, that sort of healing of memory is what's incredibly important if we're going to have the kind of identity that can really help us see through the lies that are used to divide us and see that genuine democracy is anti-racist, not because it's anti-white people, but that's because right. Only a genuine democracy can lift up everybody. And I'm sure that I know that because of the friendship and the risk that Bishop was just saying he was willing to take, and a sort of opening of ourselves to other people so we can have that kind of healing of memory.
And we're not new at it. That's one of the things I get so troubled by today with the way the media has reported, say, for instance, what's happened after George Floyd. Several things that bother me. First of all, the way that they reported like George Floyd's death alone was what caused people to come out. It's just not true. I mean, his death was like Emmett Till's, a spark, but there was so much going on. You got to look at the fact we're in the middle of COVID. People are feeling like they're dying in so many ways. You got all of this movement that's been going on for years. It didn't just happen, but sometimes I think the corporate media wants you to think that, because what that does is if you believe it, it disempowers real movement building. But the second piece of that is they say, we're seeing people come together across racial lines. It's so amazing. And maybe we'll have a chance because we've never seen this before. And I want to say, will you please read a book?
Thank you. I
How
say
do you
that all the
think-
time, but
How in the world do you think,
Written in
what
those
what do you know about slavery and black and white people that worked in the abolition movement, and then in the Reconstruction movement, and in the early Union movement, and in the women's suffrage movement, and then Frederick Douglass stood against what was happening to the Chinese people, and was also on the side of white women and suffrage and black women and suffrage, and that the NAACP was a predominantly white organization in its founding. First 3 chairs were white. I mean, what? You know, will you read something and stop acting like we are somehow some nuance that's never been? And so in some ways our friendship models, you know, the only way we've ever really moved forward in this country, you know. And I had to one day, Dr. Smith, own my own reality, you know, and sometimes people, I was telling somebody my reality one day and they said, yeah, but you black when the police stop you. I said, that's just foolish. I was trying to explain to them that I'm black, I'm Tuscaroran Indian, and I'm white. I have cousins that are as blue-eyed as any white person I know. I have cousins that passed because of the racism in the South. I need to know that. That some of my cousins were so bright, white, but instead of facing stuff here, they went south and became white until they got to retirement, then came back home and owned their blackness. All of that's a part of my life. The Tuscaroran side is a part of my life. And what white people did to the Tuscaroran Indians, you know, is a part of my life. My grandfather growing up as a coal miner in Kentucky, my grandmother, you know, coming from on my maternal side, coming from slaves and others in Georgia. On my paternal side, none of them were ever slaves. They were all free issue. But I got all that wrapped up in my reality. And you can't be totally who you are until you own who you are and all of it.
I mean, maybe that's the interesting thing about using personal connection as a model, as an entry point for thinking about the nature and the utility of political coalition, right? Because on the one hand, I could oversimplify and say, your friendship is about modeling what coalition or solidarity looks like and how it's built. But that doesn't capture the many layers and facets and complexity and multiplicity of y'all or your relationship. So there's, you know, and maybe I'm wrong, but I imagine there's the kind of like public work of being friends. And then there's the more mundane, everyday stuff that comes with being friends. He keeps finishing my sentences. He thinks he knows what I think more than I, you know, like that stuff, or the kind of, you know, I'm a black person, I'm a white person, as if that captures the entirety of someone's somethinghood. So, what'd you say?
Those categories are just far too simple. Just like, which is why Jonathan and I challenge the simplicity of terms like left and right, and Democrat and conservative versus liberal. I tell folks, I'm both. You can't be a liberal and a conservative. I said, yes, I can. I said, because I want to conserve the fundamentals of the Constitution, which means establishing justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, equal protection under law, voting rights, so forth. And I want to liberally spread it to everybody else. I said, you're the one that's stuck in the language. I don't have to be stuck in the language. I'm not going to spend my whole day calling somebody the right and then try to convince you they're the wrong. You may want to use that language. You may want to stay stuck in the 17th century, the French Revolution. I don't have to stay stuck there. But too often we keep trying for these simplistic ways to understand complex issues. And I think what Jonathan and I have tried to, it's not simplistic, yet on a level, yeah, there's sometimes I can give him a thought and he can finish it. And likewise, but you know what that means in some sense? That we are not just friends, but in this movement, you become family. That becomes a thinking and a heart. You know, we read some of the same stuff. We study, we look at scripture similarly. We share different books we've read. We write, and you really end up becoming the beloved community, both in personal, but also politically. You know, you become more than just a friend, but you become like family. I mean, I don't have a brother. My brother died a couple of years ago, but you know, I would call Jonathan my brother anywhere, anytime, anywhere. You know, I think one time I did that. We were somewhere and I said, my brother's coming in. And when he came in, the person that was at the hotel just kind of looked. That's your brother? Yeah, family.
Yeah,
You know, but it can't be possible in the spirit. We're theologians, you know, we're people of the spirit, people of the Lord. That's really why even in the church, the greatest term of compliment is brother or sister.
Yeah, I was thinking about these ties that bind us. I do think it has a lot to do with our understanding of who we are. When, you know, when Reverend Barber's brother died, I was grieving with him, but you know, I also remember the next time I saw your mama, I just had to hold her for a minute, because through our relationship, we're connected with other people. You know, similarly, when my grandfather died, you know, he reached out and consoled my mother, and she told me about it later. So I think that part of what that has shown us is that the kind of coalition that we try to do is necessarily not just about getting people together around, you know, an agenda, or just sort of, you know, teaching an analysis and a history that gets people together, but actually bringing people together in spaces, right? To share life together. That's a huge piece of the kind of fusion organizing we're trying. And I think it's why the cultural arts are such a big part of it. You know, if we can't figure out how to do bluegrass and gospel together, then we're probably not going to keep, you know, people from such different backgrounds together. And I think that's, you know, ongoing work, but it's about learning to celebrate the real gifts. You know, I mean, I'm sitting here with, I think, hands down, the greatest preacher in this country right now. He's a preacher in a.
Why, thank you. No.
He's a preacher in a very particular tradition, right? And his mastery of that craft is deeply connected to that tradition, which of course is tied to the Black church and the Black experience and all that. But that can weave in with, you know, lots of other things in a way that I think makes us a richer and truer society. Yeah, to see that our different traditions can build us all up rather than, you know, conflict or somehow be in competition with one another.
And I think I would be clear. I told Jonathan this. I think he's the most profound storyteller. He can take a piece of something, just like the way he can write about the sand sitting on the seat on the riverbank, and then connect that to the people first seeing it, and then connecting that to people first embarking, the first slaves on American soil. I mean, just to tell a story, right? And so as we fuse those gifts in the midst of service, becomes very critical to this work. Now, we would be the first, though. I think, John, I could say this, that he and I would be the first to back up anybody who would come to us and say, now, see, that's just what we need. If we could just be friends like that, we wouldn't have to worry about all this marching and protesting and whatnot. We would be the first to say,
That's right.
You just
We're not friends like Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham are friends.
Yeah. No, you just missed it. Our friendship is not. And this business about where we just need to change folk one at a time. Yeah. And we don't really need to be pushing all of these, you know, being involved in politics. If we could just get everybody to be friends in Jesus. And like John time I said, well, when you got to be Jesus' friend, you got crucified one way or the other. You got to be Jesus' friend. Caesar didn't like it, and neither did Herod. When you became Jesus' friend, you know, you challenge the systems of injustice. So don't deflate either or make this some simplistic reality. We are calling for in the movement deep relationship, fused relationship, to the point at which when we do organizing, we're saying to folk, when a small fusion organizing, what makes it different than coalition building is a lot of times coalition building is transactional. People come in for their issue. And then if they happen to win their issue using the body, once they've won their issue, they move. Because their issue is won. What fusion says is all connected. So you can't talk about poverty and not talk about racism. You can't talk about systemic racism without talking about poverty. You can't talk about racism without talking about all forms of racism, but not just toward Black people. You can't talk about, and it takes this coalition to come at all of the injustices because they're interlocking. And sometimes they're so interlocking, you don't know where one connects and the other one unconnects. It's so woven together. And so what happens in a real sense, you have to simultaneously challenge them, simultaneously with this kind of intersectional. And sometimes you even have to get real creative. For instance, Jonathan will remember one day we were going before the North Carolina General Assembly when they were passing the racist voter suppression laws and telling us they weren't racist. We knew they were racist, and the courts would later prove to us, they proved to everybody else they were racist. But I remember going in one day, I don't know if you were there, Jonathan, that day, and there was a lady from Georgia, about 75, almost 80 years old, and I had prepared our remarks to challenge the committee around the racist voter suppression as it impacts Black people. And this sister that was a part of the movement, and the part of the future, she said, what I want you to do is let me do the Black part and you do the women part today. And I said, what? She said, you said this was fusion, right? I said, yeah. She said, I'm from Georgia. I said, you mean white woman? Yep. And she got up and she riffed. She looked at him, she said, I know exactly what you all doing, because I remember my daddy and my granddad used to do the same thing, sitting in our house. You all know what you're doing to us. She said, you know what you're doing to us, Black people. And she was white. You know, and she said, I know exactly what you're doing. This voter suppression is racist. And then I said, oh, that's how we're rolling today. So when I got up, I said, I would like to talk about how these photo ID laws and rolling back same-day registration is hurting women. And I didn't see that as giving away my race platform. I saw it as expanding the race platform. Because one of the legislators said, excuse me, Reverend Bob, you want to talk about what? I said, that's right. I want to talk about the women's side. In fact, I want to talk about how it's hurting white women. And for a moment there, it left them kind of befuddled, right? But that's what moral fusion movement does. It moves people into a space where we see that we are all interconnected, and we have to be if we're going to take on these interlocking injustices.
So I find that a much more, I think that's a helpful way to think about it, and a helpful way to frame it, and a helpful way to come at it. Because I find myself increasingly out of charity with people and not trusting the language of allyship that comes as we are doing this on behalf of you out of our guilt. Like, I'm just not interested or invested or honestly willing to listen. And so we are going to turn to the Q&A actually in a minute. So I'm about to say something that I don't.
Can I steal that?
What'd you say?
I like the way you steal that. That ally, I'm coming along to help you, folks. No, you helping yourself.
Yeah.
It's racism killing you too.
Yeah,
right?
and if you don't know that, I mean, and this is where.
Exactly.
Yeah, then one, you won't stay, and two, I'm not sure that I mean, I am a teacher by vocation. I have to, and my mother has reminded me over and over this summer that this is the job that I chose, and that I am required to be more generous with people than they will ever return to me, because that is my calling. But there are definitely moments when I think, I can't teach you everything. And I'm not sure I want to stand here and try. And so one of my questions was going to be for y'all, where you find the compassion and the capaciousness to view people's weaknesses, their delusions, their shortcomings with generosity, right? Because I feel like that well can run dry really, really quickly, at least on the Adriane side.
And a lot of times it will run dry if you stay around, and I'm gonna probably get hit for this, the so-called professional activists who have already drawn up their lines of battlement and their grants. We do different work. We go among the people, right? And that's where you find out, as I said the other day, it's too often liberal whites, for instance, overestimate their being non-racist, and they underestimate their own racism, and they overestimate the racism of poor white folks.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, we go into circles and we find where people are real clear, and when we work with them and teach them and move among them, they are some of the clearest people in the world. But sometimes people become professional activists, professional whatever, and we develop all these nice, cute words and what do we call it, synergies, and we call it theories of change, and we come up with all this stuff, And we almost go to people with a kind of paternalism. And well, the difference with us is we go among people as they are. And so when we went to Kentucky, to Harlan County, Kentucky, and spent time with coal miners there and brought people from Black people from Louisville, half of the time we were there was listening to Black coal miners and white coal miners who have had to fight together and remembering the great stories. You know, like people were telling us, well, Harlan County, you can't go to Harlan County, Reverend Barber. You know the people up there? I said, do you know the people up there? Yes, they all voted for Trump. No, they didn't. They didn't vote all for Trump. Well, 80% voted for Trump. I said 80%.
A bunch of them didn't vote.
That's right. I said, a lot of them didn't vote. So what about the then they said, well, that's a racist. I said, well, no, that's again, Harlan County is also where Justice Harlan was from. They called him the Great Dissenter. It was a white justice who dissented when they tried to overturn the 1875 Civil Rights Act. He dissented in Plessy versus Ferguson. Also the place where you had the first interracial union break out in Kentucky, was some of the first places. It's also the place of Ann Breeden. I mean, and so and all that's in the soil, all that's in the air, all that's in the mountain is granular there, right? But if you come with all these preconceived notions, that actually, it disables you from being compassionate, right? Because
I'm going to pause you because I think it's a good pause point, and also because people are now flooding the Q&A with questions for us.
Here we go.
So we're going to come back to you, but we have to. So, and for the reminder, some of y'all have found the place to ask the questions. That's on the little Q&A button down there at the bottom of your screen. But if you have a question and you haven't found it, put it down there and we'll try to get it to as many as we can.
I keep standing up, not because when I'm getting mad, but because my back hurts.
You're gonna type your question.
You know what? But if you both, your back can hurt and you can be feeling it at the same time.
That's right.
So here's the first question. What role do you feel faith and Christianity play in our current struggle with racial injustice in this country?
Issues or religious issues in public life, we don't think about the struggle for, justice and equality that transformed the South. We think about these narrow wedge issues, and it's not an accident, right? Oil companies and other, vested interests in the economy as it exists have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into convincing, particularly white folks, but it's not just white folks, it's trickled on out, and they have their plans to get to Black folks, to get to Hispanic folks, that the convincing that the only religious issues are where you stand on abortion, where you stand on sexuality, and that sort of thing. No, those aren't, frankly, common life issues. Most of those issues are quite, concerns of individuals and things that people have to figure out in their own context. But on the huge issues of our public life, right, on justice and morality and how we're going to treat one another, the Bible says we've got to tend this earth and keep it. And the oil companies have spent 40 years telling white Christians you can't trust climate science. I don't see how you claim to worship the creator of the universe and say we can let it all burn. But they've convinced us.
Right.
It's many of us.
That's right. Well, I think it has everything to do with it. If you look at it from the standpoint of God's politics, and this battle is as old as the false prophets of Pharaoh against the real prophet named Moses. There's always been this tension. The whole Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible are about prophets who stood up to kings. They weren't people who stood and closed their eyes and said, if you walk over there, you're going to get a car. That's not what they did. The prophets were those who took on the systems of injustices, who dared to stand before kings and say things like, woe unto you who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make children and women your prey. They dared to call out injustice. They dared to say when politicians were hurting the poor and immigrants, your politicians have become like wolves. And the priests are worse than that because they tell them that God has said things that God has not even said. And because of this, because the priests have aligned themselves with the unjust king, you have all of this distortion and hurt of the poor. Or as Jesus, before he could even get up, Herod wanted to kill him because he represented the new reality. Or Jesus being crucified as a rebel, as a rebel, crucifixion was something that was set aside particularly for those who dared to challenge the systems of injustice. So it's as old as the scriptures, but it's also as old as the fight against slavery. it's interesting that Frederick Douglass said, because I love the religion, I love the Christianity of Jesus, I hate the religion of the slave master. He never said the slave master had Christianity. It's very distinct in that. He said, because I love the Christianity of Jesus, I hate the religion of the slave master. And what has happened today is a lot of things we call Christian is not Christian. We come up with all these terms like the Christian right or the Christian. There's no such thing really biblically. Those are not even ways we should be describing faith. Faith should be looked at the fruit it bears and how it lines up with the politics of God, not the politics of a party. And so Frederick Douglass said, because I love the Christianity of Jesus, I have to hate the religion of slave master. It's as old as right after the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt was trying to put the New Deal in place, and businesses hated it. So what did? They went out and paid a man to go out and create a form of religion in America that would cause the New Deal socialism. They paid him about $10 million. His name is out of California. There's a book on it called One Nation Under God by Kevin Cruz out of Princeton. Oh, yeah. Lays it all out, the purchasing of the American pulpit. This stuff is not accidental. You know, it was there when Dr. King was talking and others were talking about justice. He had two things to fight. He had to fight the segregationists who believed that their segregation was in fact of God, but he also had to fight the so-called moderates that said, well, let's just pray and be cool. So today, when we see all of this death of public policy, the death because of denial of healthcare, and I'm not just talking about since COVID. Before COVID, there were 140 million people living in poverty, 700 people a day dying from poverty. Before COVID, 5,600 people were dying for every 1 million people denied healthcare. Before COVID, you had massive numbers of people dying from environmental injustice. So COVID may have exposed it. As somebody said, the pandemic exposed the pandemonic of racism and of greed in this country. Well, if those things that happen, the church faith cannot be silent. One of my professors said, you can call it whatever you want. His name is Dr. William Turner. Said you can call it baptized, blood-bought, spirit-filled, dipped, sprinkled, meditated, whatever you want to call it. But if that spirituality doesn't produce a quarrel with the world, whether or not it's Christian is terribly suspect. So faith is supposed to have a prophetic quarrel with the world. And then lastly, Sister Smith, to that caller, you know, we are in a mess now. Still 400 years later, from slavery to now, we've not been able to deal with this issue of racism fully because racism was built on 4 pillars. The first pillar was evil economics, that the end justifies the means. And as long as it makes money, it doesn't matter what evil you have to commit. That's why, and one of the reasons why economics was removed from the study of moral philosophy. Economics used to not be a subject. It was moral philosophy. That was moved in this country particularly. The second thing was bad biology, that a person's biological reality, right, is and their color makes them different. The third was sick sociology, that biological difference, in some ways different, many ways the same, but that biological color difference then meant you had to be lower or beneath. And then the last one, though, was the ultimate one, and that is heretical ontology. And that is convincing oneself. And you can go in the stacks over at Duke or Yale or Harvard, go up in the stack and pull out all kinds of books that are there right now that were written to justify slavery, that were written to undergird this heretical ontology. And because of those 4 pillars, that evil quadrilateral is why racism has had such a hook and a hold and a hellish grip on our society. And you cannot cast out that demon without the religious critique that has to come from deep faith.
Amen to that.
Well, let the church say, let the Zoom say amen.
Hey.
Considering both historic instances of racial unity propelling, here, I'm gonna go back and read. Considering both historic instances of racial unity propelling social, political progress and the current racialized division in America, do you think we have regressed in terms of racial consolidation? If so, how and why?
Do I think we've regressed?
Yes, regressed.
Yeah. You know, I struggle with the re-words. So let me just own that. Like when people say we need reconciliation, I said, well, what? Well, okay.
When did we conciliate?
We need conciliation. So, like, have we regrets? Like, did we come a ways forward and then we are stepping back? You know, it's a curious question. In some ways, we have come forward. Like, we came forward in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, but then in 2013, we regressed. When the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, the very act that Lyndon Baines Johnson and others said was the greatest victory in America, including any of its wars, was the fully opening up the democracy. Not just for Black people, but white women couldn't even serve on juries until after the Voting Rights Act in 1965. A lot of white sisters don't know that. So we have regressed in that way. But then in some ways, we had never fully come forward to begin with. That's why it's so, you know, you have to almost be a contortionist to deal with American history. So in some ways,
here.
the Voting Rights Act that we had was a compromise in and of itself. The Civil Rights Act, people forget that. This is the March on Washington coming up, the 57th anniversary. John Lewis, remember that day, he was saying this bill is not enough. He said this bill is not enough. It's not enough if it doesn't address the sharecropper who loses his land when he loses his farm when he tries to register to vote. And it's not enough if it doesn't make sure that the maid that makes $5 a week in a house that earns $100,000 a year is taken care of. He was criticizing the what would become the 64 Civil Rights Act. And it was so filibustered, Jonathan, that by the time it passed, when it was passed, a lot of the civil rights leaders read it and said, wait a minute, there's less in here. In fact, if there's a speech that Malcolm does in late 64, maybe late 64, maybe early, no, it's late 64 in Detroit, where he talks about the ballot versus the bullet. And in that speech, Malcolm criticizes the 64 Civil Rights Act and declares that we had been fooled. Yeah. And what he was talking about was there was one thing promised right after the March on Washington, but then it was compromised and filibustered down until it was an act, but it was not all that was necessary, which is why you then have to come back and do the Voting Rights Act. You have to come back and do the Fair Housing Act. So in some sense in this history, we've moved forward, then we regressed, and in some places we never even moved forward.
Yeah, sometimes the metaphor that people use is the, one step forward, two steps back. But I think what you're describing is more of a system that adjusts itself to keep the power where the power has been in new and different ways, and then to develop new arguments that justify that. And so, while we can name some things that have changed, that have, made life genuinely better for people, I think the stubbornness of this system to keep power consolidated in the hands of a few is what we have to acknowledge, and what we're trying to build power for people to rise up to say only a mass movement of people who take power and are able to get the leverage of power are frankly even going to be able to save us from catastrophic destruction. Because we're trying to lift up the voices of people who are already poor, been poor for a long time. But if you look at where we're headed in the next 3-4 decades in terms of the climate crisis, I mean, we're talking about whole communities being utterly destroyed. And if the folks who are in charge stay in charge, we just gonna barrel right over the edge. They've made that very.
And if you look at what we're headed toward now in terms of poverty, we're headed not toward a Great Depression, because some people have been in Great Depression for long. We're headed toward a Great Destruction. We're talking about, we're headed toward over 50% of this nation being in poverty and low wealth. We're headed to 120, 130, 140 million people without health care in the richest nation in the country. I'm not talking about 5 years from now. I'm talking about in this year coming with COVID. We've talked with a number of epidemiologists and public health officials who have said that people, yes, Trump was inept, and his ineptness was terrible. But not only was he inept in his response to poverty, he was inept in his response to COVID, his addressing poverty and racism, so much so that COVID is actually exploiting the fissures of racism and poverty.
Right.
It's really, that's one of the reasons it's really staying alive. And so that because of those realities, and we've not chosen to address them. And so, you know, we've got these different ways of looking at progress and regression. Give you one more example. This is probably might get me in a little trouble, but it's okay. In 2010, President Obama was president, and Eric Holder was the Attorney General. North Carolina passes the worst gerrymandering, racist gerrymandering plan we've seen since Jim Crow. We in the movement stand up against it, and we go to the Justice Department while the pre-clearance was still in effect. And it was the Holder Justice Department that approved that racist gerrymandering plan that then created the reality of the supermajority in 12. We had to wrestle, what is this? Now, we knew what it was like to fuss at white people in those positions. But what is it when we have a black president and a black attorney general and a gerrymandering plan that 6 years later the courts would call racist? The courts would say it created constitutionally, unconstitutionally constituted General Assembly. Well, why couldn't somebody see that there, or did they see it? But chose for whatever reason not to worry about it since it was quote unquote in the South, right? So we have these real regression and I remember being in court one day and this white judge from South Carolina asked the people who were fighting for racial voter suppression, he just stopped the court and said, let me ask you a question. Why don't you want people to vote? And the lawyer's response to him, well, since we don't have the Voting Rights Act, retrogression is okay. That was actually said in a federal court with us sitting in the room hearing it.
Right.
So, you know, to answer that question, yes, we've come far, but yes, we've done some retrogression, but some places, if I might be country a little bit, we need some gression before we can talk about retro.
So I'll just throw in, and then we'll go to what might be our last question, depending on how this unfolds, because we are quickly running out of time. But I've been very struck that in the midst of minor reflections on being 15 years out from Katrina, nowhere near as much conversation as you'd think that we have about it, but a hurricane was bearing down on the Gulf Coast, right? That this is a disaster, you know, that there's a lot of discussion of regret and, you know, mea culpas or what have you over Katrina, and very little done to stop everything that sort of comes behind it. And as I say to my daughter, when she'll do something that we've told her not to do a million times and something disastrous will happen, and she'll say it was an accident. It's like, if you know that all of these things are likely to lead to an outcome, it's hard to call things an accident. But anyway, that was my side rant about that. I'm going to hush and I'm going to ask this question instead. This student asks, what advice do you have for us college-age students about how to use our friendships to attempt to create positive change in the ways that you two have?
Well, first of all, I want you all to come on into the Moral Monday movement and join us. That's what I want you to do. I want you to join the Mass Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival, hook up with Repairs of the Breach, bring those friendships right on into movement. It's time, it's your time. This is the time for us to all stand together, and I'm very, very serious about that. We have a large contingency of young people and others who are not the leaders of tomorrow in this movement, but they are the leaders right now. They're in the room right now. Every race, creed, color, sexuality, they're all in the room right now. And so, you know, I want to say, get in now. Get all you can academically, and commit that those academics that you get are going to be used to change the world, not just to get a job, but to literally change the world. And I want to step back 1 second, and then I'll let Jonathan have the last word since we're getting close to time. But I can't let pass what you just said about the hurricane and how it relates to this young lady's question about friendship. You know, I've been weeping today because I've got friends in Cancer Alley. I got Black friends in Cancer Alley. I've got white friends in Cancer Alley. I've got people in Cancer Alleys in an 81-mile stretch of land that used to be the worst plantation in this country when the slaves tried to revolt, they cut the heads off of slaves and put them on sticks all up and down the river to let them know you will not leave the sugar plants. And then those sugar plants then became sharecroppers. And then now the sharecropping land has become the ownership of the worst chemical plants in the world. And they put them there on top of those people and they are dying. I mean, I visited not too long ago, I was down there and one lady had 5 family members that died in less than 2 weeks, 5 family members. We went down there and we actually said anyone that wants to occupy 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, if they can't come by Cancer Alley, they aren't worthy to do that. And yet people stay away from that area because there's so much money. There's so much money in these chemical companies. And they see these people as obsolete and they've got genocide. Now, why am I weeping today? Because on top of that, the last time I was there, they showed us this big dome. It looks like a football dome. And I asked the question to one of the dear brothers, what is that? He said, well, it's not a football dome. He said that what you see is a dome built out of the poisonous material and mixed with cement. And inside of it is all the poisonous material. And he said, and there's already predictions that if the right storm comes along, it will break that dome open and over 1 billion gallons of poisonous materials will not only spew on us, but will spew into the Mississippi River and run on right down to New Orleans and other places. And I'm so worried tonight. I'm so worried tonight because that storm is going right across there. And it doesn't have to be that way. And they're trying to build another one right now. And the people down there are black and white and they're fighting. And when we went down there, they said, thank you for just coming to see us because really nobody cares us. The news doesn't come down here. We made a commitment that we're going to draw international and national attention to that. But those people down there are family, whether they be black or white, they're family, and they have no other choice. You know, there's a sense in which the answer to your sister's question is, the young lady's question is, sit down tonight and ask yourself what you have no other choice but to be involved in. There comes a point in your life, and it can come very young. It doesn't have to come when you're 90 and about to die. It can come very young in your life that you make a decision that your life is only meaningful for the rest of it, however long it lasts, is if you're involved in something that makes a difference and have meaning. I would ask you to look at our website, look at the facts, and if those facts draw you in, whatever degree you're getting, if they draw you in and say, listen, as a part of all I'm doing, I need to be a part of that movement, then we welcome you in the family. Come on in the family, and come on, let's work together for a better world and a better America.
I'll just say one thing about why I want you to join. I want you to join because of the kind of formation in friendship that we were talking about earlier. I think this movement gives you an opportunity to get to know and to let your reality be shaped by people that you're not going to get to know otherwise. It's a great privilege and gift that you get to study at Duke University, but let's be honest, the colleagues and friends that you meet at Duke University are now or are going to become part of the ruling class in this society. And there are norms and assumptions in the ruling class that have kept us in the mess that we're in. And I think it's critical that you develop friendships with people who are not like you, who have not had the opportunities you've had, and a kind of solidarity that allows you to see that what is happening in the world that's hurting them is ultimately also hurting all of us. And that until we bind together, link up, and transform this system that is crushing people, none of us can be well. And that's the true end of education, is to learn how to live well. I pray that you'll learn to live well, and that you can do that by linking up with poor and low income people who are fighting for their lives in this country.
Yep.
Amen to that too. And thank you both for this conversation, for your work, for the Poor People's Campaign, for Moral Mondays, which kept me from losing my mind throughout the 2000s, and for this reminder that doing something in the world to reimagine and remake the world is a gift that we give ourselves and our children and each other. And so many thanks to you all. Thanks to y'all out in the audience for being here. Please come back next week when Marshall Goldsmith and Jim Young Kim will be the next conversants in this Reimagining Our World series. And until then, take care of yourselves and each other, vote, do good things, and try to make it better. All right, bye.
Forward together, not one step back.
Amen. Bless you all.
All right, bye.